And maybe seated. Am I the only one that's really warm? Oh, Keith already got up to do it. I normally hit that thing down a degree. It's amazing the difference between 68 and 69, but it's just toasty in here. Open your Bibles with me, if you would, Revelation chapter 21. I asked you last week, how much do you think about heaven? Of course, Matthew, with the song selection, got us thinking that way. But it's a challenge that we become so earthly minded and earthly busy that we don't think heavenly nearly as much maybe as we could or should. And some of that is just hard to help. Some of it's balance. Some of it is taking time every day to redirect our thoughts heavenly and try to disconnect from the worldly. But Revelation 21 has been reminding us of eternity. Jesus has reclaimed and reestablished. He's reclaimed everything. He's reestablished His kingdom. And we're setting it back to paradise. It was started in paradise. It's going to be set back to an even greater paradise. In Revelation 21, tonight we'll look at the New Jerusalem and some of its details, and realize that that is the dwelling place of the bride, and it is capital city of the new earth. Let's read chapter 21, starting at the beginning. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And remember, that doesn't mean renovated. That doesn't mean rebuilt. That means completely new from scratch, started over. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. We've read several times in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, where Peter tells us that it will be dissolved with fervent heat. I don't know how to interpret all that, but I can read it, and I basically can understand that concept. I don't know how the Lord will bring all that to pass, but the current heaven and earth will dissolve away, pass away. No more sea is a reminder to us that the entire system, the planetary system, the environment, the entire system will change. Ours now is so water-based. He says, no more sea. I don't know the role that water will play in the New Jerusalem and New Heaven, New Earth with glorified bodies, but it won't play the role that it does now. Not for the environment, not for the bodies. So I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven, the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So it's perfectly made up. It's spectacularly decorated, and he likens it prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself shall be with them and be their God." There will not any longer be divided time, divided hearts, divided priorities. All new. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Tears are a thing of the past. And there shall be no more death. It's a thing of the past. Neither sorrow nor crying, nor shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. All of the things that we're used to in these bodies, it's gone. We have glorified bodies. And He that sat upon the throne said, "Behold, I make all things new." And He said unto me, "Write, for these words are true and faithful." Write it down, John. Record it forever. It's going to come to pass. And he said unto me, it is done. And I interpret verse 6, it is done. Redemption's work is finished. That is complete. While the Lord said it's finished on the cross, we know that there's still a lot of saving to do. He's been saving lives and hearts and souls ever since. It's done here. Redemption's work is fully complete as I understand it. I am Alpha and Omega. In other words, I'm qualified to say when it's done, I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. And he that overcometh shall inherit all things. And I will be his God, and he shall be my son. So in verses 7, the end of the latter half of verse 6 and verse 7, we see some of the characteristics of those that will dwell in the city. They're thirsters. They're thirsty. There's those that thirst. He's going to satisfy that. They're overcomers. Verse 7. They're sons. The end of verse 7. But the fearful, they're not resting in the Lord. They're not confident of their eternity. They're fearful because they're faithless. The fearful and the unbelieving and the abominable and the murderers and the whoremongers and the sorcerers and the idolaters and the liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And we've already studied that in the end of chapter 20. We pick up tonight now in verse 9. And there came unto me one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials full of the 7 last plagues. So we don't know which of the 7. Of course, I don't recall that they were named anyway. But one of the same 7 that had the vials of the last plagues, he came to John and talked with me, saying, Come hither. I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain. And he showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Now, we're going to emphasize this a little more in more detail tonight. The city's not the bride. That wouldn't make any sense. If I were taking someone to meet my wife and she was at home, I would take somebody and I would take them to the home where she dwells. You read all about the details of this city, and you see the bride in the city not as one and the same, but that the bride is dwelling in the city. And the city has all these details. And we know that for absolute certainty because throughout the New Testament, John describes the relationship of the Lord and a true understanding of the New Testament church, his bride. And I want to reinforce some of that just a little bit. I want to use the language that Paul's using in 2 Corinthians 11. Bear with me just a little bit if this is very familiar to you. I dare say it's probably not familiar to everyone. But in 2 Corinthians 11, let's notice the language that Paul uses as he's addressing the church at Corinth. And in verse 2, he said, I'm jealous over you. Who's he talking to? The congregation that is located in Corinth. In other words, a body of believers that's located in a specific place. In other words, a visible, literal congregation of people. Probably every one of you here that has a Bible commentary, they will reference a universal bride, universal church. That's not what the Scripture teaches. I'm sorry. That's not what it teaches. Paul here is addressing the church, the congregation, the literal body of believers located at First and Main of Corinth or wherever it was located. And he says, I have espoused you to one husband that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So he's talking to a body of believers, and he says, you're engaged to Christ. In other words, you're going to be the bride. You're espoused. And let's look at Ephesians chapter 5 and see the language of the Lord here. In the midsection of this chapter, or down around the mid-20s, he has a lengthy discussion about the relationship between a husband and a wife. And the husband loving the wives, and the wives submitting to the husbands. And he's outlining the right relationship between a husband and a wife. And he gets to the end of that, and he says, verse 31, he quotes Genesis, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery. I speak concerning Christ and the church." Everything he described about a husband and a wife, he's been using as an illustration to illustrate the relationship between Christ and His church. Now you have to rightly define the church. And throughout the New Testament, we've seen it as local, visible bodies in specific places that make up His bride. So, in the New Testament, what is that? In the New Testament, what does that look like? What are some of the characteristics? Well, we know that the Lord said that He founded His church, He established His church, He was going to build His church, and we begin to see, that's Matthew 16:18, "On this rock I will build my church, gates of hell shall not prevail against it." He started that building process while upon this earth. Again, your Bibles with the notes in it and the various commentaries on it, it's going to say, most of them are going to say that it started at Pentecost. But there are dozens of illustrations to say that the church didn't start at Pentecost. The church was already in existence at Pentecost. The church had already had business meetings before the day of Pentecost, and so on. The church of Jerusalem. And so he said he's going to start his church. He said he's going to, and the tense of it is that I'm going to start, I'm going to build, I'm going to keep building. And that's, of course, Matthew 16:18. And he says in that passage, or what I want you to see about that is that he said he would start it. You go to the Luke passage and see, let's go to Luke chapter 6. Let's go to Luke chapter 6. I won't chase this for a long time, but it's to get the picture of what's going on in this New Jerusalem, we have to understand what the New Testament church is. He said, I'll build it, Matthew 16:18. I'll build it, I'll keep on building. It's my assembly. In Luke 6, he goes up in verse 12, and it came to pass in those days that he went out to a mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer. And when it was day, he called unto him his disciples. And so you get that picture. He's been praying all night. He's come down, he's come out into the public, and verse 12, he calls unto him his disciples. There's an unnumbered number of disciples around him that he has summoned unto himself, and of them he chose 12, whom also he named apostles. So he comes out of this all night of prayer, comes down, gets a megaphone. I don't know what he does, texting, emailing, whatever he did. And he called around him his disciples. And then he chose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You all come with me. And he called them apostles. Now over in 1 Corinthians 12, it tells us in verse 28 that he placed first in the church the apostles. So I see that as the foundation, which is what Ephesians 2:20 says, built on the foundation. Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. And I love that. Who was that Sunday? Matthew. I love that. That what the foundation is shaped like, that's what the building ends up looking like. That's a great illustration of the Lord's church. And so, let's go back to the book of Revelation with an understanding of the New Testament church. And what you have to understand about what I said in Luke 6, where he gathered, while in his personal ministry, he gathered around him his disciples and he called them, renamed them apostles, placed the apostles first in the church, 1 Corinthians 12:28. And then we see him say in Matthew 18, if there's a dispute, tell it to the church. Church is already there. Matthew 18, long before his crucifixion, long before his ministry has come to a close, he's already telling the disciples, if they've got a problem amongst themselves, to tell it to the church and have the church help settle it. So the church of the Lord Jesus Christ, that in the New Testament is likened unto a bride of Christ, that church started while Christ was upon this earth. That church was started by Christ, and the important part about that is every church brand that has been started since Christ is too late. This is this church based on this person. This is this denomination based on this person. This is this denomination based on this person. And you go back and you read their own history. I'm not throwing stones. You read their own history, and it was started in whatever, by whomever, and it's too late. If it wasn't while Christ was upon this earth and started by Christ, it was too late. It was simply too late. It had to be, the writers will call that in the church of antiquity. The one that dates all the way back, past all the reformers and past all the other ones and all the modern pop-ups of today, and all the way back to the Lord Jesus Christ. That is a New Testament church. And the New Testament church, a local visible body that locates at a certain place, is called the bride of Christ. And the angel says to John, I want to show you the bride. And John, first thing he sees is New Jerusalem, because that's where the bride dwells. John was taking him there. So let's pick up the narrative. I don't know where I left off. We'll start in verse 9. And there came unto me one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials, full of the seven last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, and I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. So John has a mountain view perch of New Jerusalem coming down, descending out of heaven from God. And he's going to begin to describe the layout and the structure and the foundations and the gates and so on of the city. He's going to tell us some amazing details. Remember what I read to you last week out of John 14? Where the Lord told the apostles, and that's the only people that he's speaking to in John 14. And at that point only 11, because Judas is gone and Matthias hasn't been chosen yet. So he's got the 11 in John 14 in front of him. And he said, in my Father's house are many mansions. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And he's talking to the apostles in John 14. I'm going to prepare a place for you. We're looking at it in Revelation 21. That place that has been prepared for the bride. We're looking at it. He carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain. He showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. You remember I told you that, and I read it to you, that in Luke 6, the Lord had the disciples around him, and of them he called 12, and he just, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you guys come with me, you're apostles. And the church was built on the foundation of the apostles, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. That's a rough quote of Ephesians 2:20. What do you call that? That the Lord chose the 12 apostles. No other way to look at it but he elected them. The Bible doctrine of election. And that's can be described as the elect within the elect. That he has his disciples around him, and of those he elected 12 and called them apostles. You see, the Lord's making up his bride as he sees fit. Another one you can write down, 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 18. He said, he adds to the body as it pleases him. That's his prerogative to add to his body as it pleases him. 1 Corinthians 12:28. He's making up his bride. He's doing it as he sees fit. John's getting to see the dwelling place here. And I bring that up about election, about him making up the bride as he sees fit, because in verse 11 he says, having the glory of God. What do we read in Exodus 33 about the glory of God? Moses asked God, let me see your glory. God says, Moses, you can't see my glory. In your body, you can't see my glory. But in verses 18 and 19 of Exodus 33, as God puts Moses in the cleft of the rock, and he's allowed to see the trailing part of God's glory. And what does God say? He said, I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy. What on earth does that mean? What on earth does that have to do with anything? Well, here's what it has to do with. The brightness of God's glory is that I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy. The brightness of his glory is that he operates with sovereign control, with nobody telling him what to do. Nobody forcing him into a corner and doing anything. His glory is the sum total of his attributes. John says in verse 11, this city has the glory of God. It reminded me of the glory that God said to Moses, in your body you can't see me. You won't live to survive it. You won't live to tell about it. But my glory is, in a nutshell, the sum total of my attributes. I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy. You can read Exodus 33, 18 and 19 and verify me on that. But he said in verse 11, having the glory of God, and her light was like unto stone most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. Of course, we don't look at what we call jasper as clear as crystal. Every commentator looks at this and says more rightly understood as a stone that would be like a diamond, and it would be clear, and it would refract the light in all directions, and it would just be brilliant and dazzling light. A lot of these gems are probably not the same names that we would have them today, and I'm not going to even try to get into those things. There are some obvious parallels between these stones and maybe the stones on the breastplate of the great high priest and so on. But not going to go down that road very far. But notice the glory of God, the brilliant splendor of God. Brilliant, dazzling light is what we're going to be seeing in this. And probably refracting through this stone clear as crystal. And remember, the words that John here is using, he's trying to use human words to describe things a human being has never seen. We're trying to grasp things that the mortal eye has never literally seen. Human words, human language is going to be inadequate. He's just giving us the best thing that He has. It's like dazzling light, clear as crystal. And it had a great wall. It had a wall great and high, and 12 gates, and at the 12 gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now, in just a little bit, in verse 21, we're going to see that the gates, the actual gate, are gates of pearl. Now, that's got to be an amazing thing to see. We won't look at it tonight. But gates of pearl. And we're going to find out that the walls are 216 feet tall. If a cubit is 18 inches, pretty much everybody agrees that it is, 216 feet tall. So when he talks about these gates here, he's talking about the openings. The actual gate is a pearl. The door, what we would call the door, is a pearl. And on these 12 gates that are in attendance, 12 angels, one at each gate, and the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, forever commemorating His relationship, His covenant relationship with Israel. Immortalizing and forever commemorating His relationship with them. Now this is a cubed. We'll see this in a minute. But verse 12, it had 12 gates. Verse 13, on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And so we're going to see develop in our the best that we can understand it is the city is going to be like a cube, and we'll see that in a little bit as we go on. And on each side 3 gates, 3 gates, 3 gates, 3 gates. So you have 12 gates, an angel at each gate. Somewhere written near the gate on the threshold, somehow over it on a placard, whatever, the names of the 12 tribes. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And so that makes sense. It's the dwelling place of the bride. And the foundation for the wall that surrounds the city has the names of the apostles. The foundation, the human foundation of the Lord's church. Again, write down Ephesians 2:20 and read it. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city, and the gates thereof, and the wall thereof. This is cool because John, where was it? Chapter 11 was told to measure the restored temple, the restored temple. And now he's giving us the dimensions of the city. That's what the restored temple is, John. This is the New Jerusalem. And so that's a neat comparison there. And the city, verse 16, lieth 4 square. And the length is as large as the breadth. Now, when you say 4 square, we're talking a cube. The length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with a reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and breadth and height are equal. It's a cube. And each side is equal. 12,000 furlongs, everybody agrees that comes out to 1,500 miles. I did some Googling today. Everybody Googles. From here to Miami is 1,500 miles and change. Okay? So we're talking about a space from here to Miami, Florida, in all directions. That's a cube. 1,500 miles. You see, you got to think about something. In glorified bodies, in eternity, Do we only have height, width, and length? Or are there more dimensions? I suspect there are. Here we have a city that's seemingly built with an extra dimension than what we're used to. And that's fine, because we're in glorified bodies. And we're in eternity. Everything has changed. Everything that you and I are used to is gone. And so you got a 1,500-mile cube. Somebody did some math on that, and if every mile was another level of this thing, 1,500 of those, there's way more surface area in the New Jerusalem than there is on planet Earth. It's just mind-boggling to think about. And he measured the wall thereof. Now there's a wall that encompasses this. Remember, it was great and high. He measured the wall thereof, 144 cubits. In other words, a cubit is 18 inches. And again, everybody agrees on that. And that equals 216 feet. So 216 feet high, all the way around the New Jerusalem, which is a cube, 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles. You have this great and high wall. And he says, and he measured the wall thereof, verse 17, 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man. That is of the angel. So the angel used human measurements to tell us this is literal. This isn't to be spiritualized. This is according to the measure of a man. It's not to be spiritualized. It's 144 cubits high. Now, the average estimation of that was this distance, and the average estimation of that is 18 inches, and 18 inches is what everybody uses, and that's 216 feet the way we would calculate it now. So 216 feet tall, a perimeter wall around the city, 4 square. And the building of the wall was of jasper, and the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. And again, that's not something we're used to, gold like unto pure glass. The terminologies are not what we're used to. Glorified bodies are not something we're used to. Eternity is not something we're used to. But light, everything is bright and light. The building of the wall was jasper. Verse 19, and the foundations of the wall of the city were garnished. They were ornate. They were decorated. You know, what do you do, Elmer, when you build a foundation? You throw some concrete in the ground, you cover it up. Not this one. These foundations are showing, at least a goodly portion of them, because they have the names of the 12 apostles written in them. The foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, and the second sapphire, and the third chalcedony, and the fourth emerald, and the fifth sardonyx, and the sixth sardis, and the seventh chrysolite, and the eighth beryl, and the ninth topaz, and the 10th chrysoprase, something like that, and the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And so all of these stones and the names of the apostles written on the foundations. The capital city of the new earth, New Jerusalem, the dwelling place of the bride. And what the wall provides is a distinct... Now remember, we'll read it later on, the gates are never closed. The wall around the city is not for fortification, not for protection. The walls around the city provide a distinct perimeter around a distinct dwelling place of the bride. The gates we'll see in verse 21 are pearls. Think about that. If the gate is as high as the wall, that's 216 feet, described as a pearl. We'll get into that, Lord willing, next week. But the wall around New Jerusalem is not for fortification. It's in part for identification, because upon the foundations of the wall are written the names of the apostles. But the wall provides a distinction from the dwelling place of the bride to those that are stated in the later part of the chapter. They can come and go. The elect of all nations can come and go. But the wall provides a division there. E.G. Cook wrote a neat little tract about the walls that encompass New Jerusalem. And his point was that it provides a distinction from the dwelling place of the bride, the Lamb's wife, the bride of Christ, and those that in the latter verses, verse 27, for example, and there shall no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. They shall come, they shall go. Verse 25 says the gates are not shut at all by day, and there is no night. So the gates are wide open. It's the dwelling place. And the wall makes a distinction, but it doesn't make fortification. What an amazing thing to begin to ponder the fulfillment of what the Lord said in John 14. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. As he looks at the apostles. Here's the place, New Jerusalem. Foundations bearing their names. Within the foundations of the walls, bearing their names. Within the walls, the bride. Come, let me show you the bride. And he begins to see New Jerusalem. Throughout the New Testament, we find the New Testament church emerging as the work of Christ, and a special work of Christ. We see it as a special work of Christ when he comes down out of the mountain in Luke 6 and he's prayed all night and he says, "You 12, come with me." We see it as a special work of Christ as he sends missionaries like Paul and Silas, and they start churches out of the church at Antioch, and then other churches start other churches, and we see that begin to explode in the book of Acts. We see the Lord starting churches, establishing churches through the human instrument of Paul and others. We see him making up his bride because he adds to the body as it pleases him. It's a very great privilege to be a member of one of the Lord's churches. It's a great responsibility, but it's a great privilege. And it, being a privilege, ought to humble us. It ought never, one ought never to be boastful in the flesh. You're going to boast in the Lord, boast that way, but not in the flesh. But don't ever take church membership in one of the Lord's churches for granted. And minimize the responsibility that's involved there. Let's stand. No, let's not. I had toyed with this